Hey everybody, and welcome back to Amity Blue. My name is Nazy. I'm finally going to be sharing with you all my tea staining and coffee dyeing method. It's part of my antiquing process, as I like to call it. The first thing you're going to need to have to stain your papers is obviously coffee or tea. Now you can choose either or, whatever you have on hand. Don't go out and make it expensive. Just use what you have on hand. And I don't mean using your really fancy Starbucks coffee. I mean getting some cheap coffee, some cheap tea, and using that to stain your papers and your textiles and anything else that you want to stain. I'm going to be using some coffee, but like I said, you can use tea. This is the coffee that I'm going to be using. I purchased this, I think, from Kroger, but you can purchase coffee wherever you are. It's pretty locally available, and it's pretty inexpensive. I recommend getting instant coffee. I prefer this method just because you can heat up your water, add your coffee, and you're done. You don't have to wait for it to brew unless you want to do that. So it all depends. So this is just the method that I like to use. So I get instant coffee and just get the cheap kind. Doesn't really matter. One thing that I do find is that the cheaper your coffee is, the stickier of a residue it will leave on your papers. And if you put your and if you put your papers in the oven, that sticky residue that is left over from the really cheap coffee can sometimes, when you go to fold your papers to put them in a signature, it can kind of cause a crease. It can make your paper break apart, basically. So you want to be very careful that when you are using pretty cheap coffee, to watch your paper in the oven and don't cook it for too long, or else it's literally going to turn into a little chip. So we don't want that. I used some Dollar Tree coffee one time and it was horrendous. I never used it again. So I'd rather spend a couple extra dollars and get cheap coffee, but not too cheap. So now that I know I'm going to be using coffee, I'm going to heat up my water. I just use a container, fill it up with water, and then pour it into like a casserole dish. That's what I do. You can brew your coffee fresh, like I said, and then obviously you don't have to wait for things to heat up. But I just fill up this container. I think it's about, I don't measure, so that's another thing. I was never into science, and when I start measuring things, it makes me feel like I'm in a laboratory. So all I do is I take this big container. I think it is, how many ounces is this? I don't even know. I believe it's like maybe 2 to 3 cups. But you can measure out your coffee with a measuring, like a cooking measuring cup. I don't do that just because I kind of already know by instinct how much water, how much coffee to put in. If you want your papers to be very grungy, then saturate your coffee. And what I mean by that is, if you want that grungy, dark, rich look to your pages, add 2 cups of water, and per every cup of water, add a tablespoon. Not a teaspoon, a tablespoon. And that will really saturate your coffee. If you want to have a light wash on your papers, just a little creamy but not grungy or too rustic looking, then I would suggest for every 2 cups, add 1 teaspoon to 1 tablespoon. So kind of play around with it. Like I said, this isn't science class. Like, you're not going to get graded of this. It's honestly just trial and error. Always start with less and then continue to add more depending on how dark you want it. So make sure you start out with a little bit and then gradually keep adding a little bit more to your solution. But I'm just going to fill this whole entire thing up with water and heat it up. Alright, so hopefully you can still hear me over my microwave. I tend to microwave my water for 2 minutes just because I want it to be very hot. Depending on the type of microwave that you have, it will heat up at different temperatures. So start out with 1 minute and then keep going up as you see fit. I find that the hotter the water is and the hotter your coffee solution is, the darker your papers will come out as well. So that's also good if you're trying to get a grungy vintage look. So here is my casserole dish. Now I want to talk quickly about the type of dish that you want to use for tea/coffee staining. I recommend using a little casserole dish like this one. This is just a regular Pyrex casserole container. I use this one because it's already kind of brownish and purplish. It has like a brown purple transparent hue. Do not use a white casserole dish. It will stain your casserole dish after, many uses. So in other words, don't use something like this. This is like one of my favorite casserole containers. It's really beautiful. It has like a floral design. but on the inside it's white. It's really pretty, but it has a design on it, and I found that I was using some of my really pretty casserole containers for distressing, and it was staining it. It was just making it look very ugly. So stick to just a cheap, plain casserole container. So now that you have your casserole container, you want to pour your water. So I poured most of the water into my casserole dish, but I did leave a tiny little bit in the little glass container, and the reason is I find that if you have two solutions, so this is obviously your main solution, but if you start a little mini solution, and what I mean by that is just a smaller solution, that will become more saturated than this one. And if you're trying to get a very rustic and vintage look, then I thoroughly suggest doing this, because you just add a little bit of your coffee and you pour it into that solution. I might add a little bit more. This smells so good. And you just kind of want to give it a little stir. Might pour a little bit more, so maybe like 1 tablespoon or a teaspoon. I don't know. Whatever floats your boat. And as you can see, it's a very saturated and intense solution. We're going to leave that to sit. What that does is that if this solution is not cutting it for you and you want it to be a little bit darker, heat this up, pour it in here, and that will make it very intense and grungy and rustic. So that's a little tip that I like to do. So that's a cool little tip to know. So now I'm going to put 2 tablespoons of my coffee into my water, and I'm going to add just a little bit more. There we go. The next step that I'm going to do is it's time to make it archival. And what I mean by that is typically the coffee solution, when you tea or coffee stain your papers, it's not archival. So 100 years go by, your pictures or your words, they might fade away a little bit. And for me personally, I don't really care, because the only person that's honestly going to be reading my stuff is me. If my kids are interested in it, then they will too. But for my journals that I sell, I do make every single solution archival. Now you can be very sciencey with this and have a pH strip and do all that. I did that the first time, and then I just kind of got the hang of it. What I do is for my solution, which is like 2 cups of water with 2 tablespoons of coffee, or 2 tablespoons and 1 teaspoon of coffee, I add about 1 teaspoon of baking soda. So I kind of eyeball it, and I add 1 teaspoon of baking soda, maybe a little bit more. And what this does is that it makes it archival. Now, if this is your first time adding baking soda to your coffee solution or your tea solution, definitely use a pH strip. I have noticed that baking soda reacts with coffee differently than with tea. Since you're trying to control the acidity, which is what makes papers archival and not archival, it's a range. But definitely, however, if this is your first time, use a pH strip. They're very affordable. You can get them on Amazon. And if you are selling your journals, or if you're creating a journal for someone and you want it to be archival, I highly recommend doing this step. But if you don't care, then it's fine. All right, so let that sit a little bit. And now what you want to do is obviously take your paper. I have some regular copy paper, some music paper. Another tip that I have, that different types of papers adhere differently to your coffee and tea. So definitely experiment with different types of papers. Like I said, if you're using just plain regular copy paper, which is what I'm going to be using today just to show you, make sure it's not too thin, or else it can rip and tear, and no one wants that. So make sure your paper is not too thin. I recommend getting cream paper if you can, especially if you're going to tea stain. You can, if you are using white copy paper, that's fine. But I prefer using cream colored copy paper for this, because you already have like a base. You already have this cream paper to start out with. And I find that I get a better color and hue when I use cream paper than when I use white. So I'm going to change the camera angle so that you can see how I dip my papers up close. Okay, so here's my coffee solution. Here was the baking soda that I put into my coffee solution. And then here is the saturated second coffee solution that I have, getting ready if I needed to. It is still pretty, it's not too hot, but it's medium, so it's not burning hot. Definitely don't soak your papers into your solution if it's burning hot. We're not trying to cause third-degree burns, we're just trying to slightly antique our paper. So I'm going to take this music paper sheet, and all I do is I dip just like this. So I take it in from the side, and then I just slightly press it in so that it just soaks into your coffee solution. Once I place my paper in here, depending on how thick it is, I leave it in here for about 50 seconds or so, 50 seconds to 1 minute. If your paper is thicker, you can leave it in for a little bit longer. If your paper is thinner, obviously you want to take it out immediately. I find paper such as lined paper tends to rip a lot more easily, and those, like let's say this was lined paper, I literally put it into my solution and then I take it out. That's what I do to the lined paper, but because this paper, it can resist a little bit more time in the solution, I'm just going to let it absorb, and then I'll take some copy paper and I will add that on top as well. So once my paper is soaking in the solution, I like to do about 3 to 4 in there at a time. I like to take some of the leftover coffee, the grounds, and I like to sprinkle them right on top and just kind of move them a little bit. And this is how you achieve those little dots that you get on your paper. Doing this method right there will give you that really antique kind of look. So I think that's a good amount of time for it to be soaking. So once it has soaked, it's time to decide if you want to leave it to dry on a table or if you want to put it in the oven. However, the method that I use is I utilize my oven, and I find that it gives it a darker, richer hue to it, but you can most certainly just leave it on your tabletop to dry overnight and you're good to go. When your papers are ready, take your baking tray. I know, it looks like a horror movie on a baking tray. It looks like someone murdered my little baking tray. This is actually after a year of coffee staining my papers. This is what my baking tray looks like, and I find this one has been giving me the best results because of all of those layers of like coffee, and just it looks like my baking pan suffered third-degree burns, but I promise it's okay. The intense dark color is due to the coffee that has remained there and then goes into the oven, and yes, some of it might be burned. That is what gives my papers that really beautiful antique effect. It's just having a really dirty and burned pan. And I wish I was lying, but I'm not. That's what truly gives you guys that really beautiful look. So I'm going to take my paper, just like that, and you can instantly see how yellow it is already. And we didn't even leave it in there for that long. And all you're going to do is you just want to put it on your tray just like that. And then I'm going to take the next one. And this one, you can see that the music paper absorbed the coffee, but not as much as the copy paper. So definitely I will leave this music sheet in my solution for a little bit longer, because this is what I mean by experimenting with different papers. You can see that the music paper, it's still a little bit too light for my liking, and this one is yellow. So this obviously helps that this paper was cream colored. So like I said, it really helps if you get cream colored paper. So now I'm going to put this into my oven. I have my oven preheated at 400 degrees. Now I know that's a little bit high for cooking papers. I kind of want them to go in and out really quickly, because normally when I'm doing journals, I have a huge stack of papers that I need to coffee stain, and it takes a long time. So if I could just get it in and out of the oven with a higher temperature, that's what I do. So I just put it in my oven, and it's going to be in there for maybe 50 seconds or so, no more than a minute, or else it will definitely burn. And depending on how hot your oven is, that's how quickly your paper will cook. So definitely just play around with your oven. All right, so my 2 pieces of paper came out the oven, and you can very much see a difference. I decided to leave the music paper in a little bit longer just so that you can see what not to do when coffee staining. And I took this one out at the perfect time so that you can see what a perfect coffee stained paper should look like. And so this is what typically my papers look like when I do the coffee staining for my journals. As you can see, it's an even stain. Some areas are a little bit darker than others, such as in the corner and wherever we put those coffee grounds on. The coffee grounds is what creates those little dots and makes it look very antiqued, but it doesn't look as if your paper burns in the oven. We're coffee staining our papers for journals, and journals are meant to be journaled on. You won't be able to write on paper that's black or really dark brown, because obviously you want it to be still a little bit light and creamy so that you can see your paper. You can add washi tape, you can still decorate on top of your paper. This is why I highly recommend you guys to use cream colored copy paper instead of white, because you get an overall even coverage, and that's the look that I like to go for. Now this piece of paper, the music paper, as you can see, it's not even. One area is more saturated in color than the rest. This one I let sit in the oven for about 1 minute and 15 seconds, and this is what came out. So uneven coverage. One area is very highly saturated, and if you go to fold the paper, you might risk it tearing in the middle. So this is why it's very important to, first of all, know the solution that you want to do, if you want a lighter base or if you want a darker base. Like I said, the 3 main important things is how much coffee you add to your solution, how long you let your paper sit into your solution, and what kind of papers you're using for your solution. And of course, if you decide to use the oven method, how long you leave your papers and at what temperature. I prefer the oven method and leaving it in at 400 degrees for about 30 to 50 seconds. This is what gives me the best results. Don't leave it in there for too long, or else you're going to end up with some paper chips, and you don't want that. So thank you so much for watching, and I hope that your day is filled with a huge abundance of peace and love. Bye-bye. Bye!